I need you to stop making documentaries like the one that you did because it scared the ever-loving shit out of me.
Oh man. Well, yeah, this was not an uplifting one to spend years of my life on.
It was, I believe, correct me if I'm wrong, but it was 7 years that you were working on it. And I'm assuming there was a lot of working on it before the documentary crew arrived. I don't know how long you shot over that time period.
Yeah, that's totally right. Because one of the first things I did, I think that 7 years entails when I was first asked to look at the largest ever Chinese purchase of an American company, and that was Shuangwei Meat buying Smithfield Foods. Shuangwei Meat's now WH Group. But I was asked to look into it, and at the time I knew nothing about food. I had no background in food, water issues. But I knew that the U.S. Senate was debating it, and there was a former CIA officer who had been asked to testify to the Senate Ag Committee. And afterwards, I just started chatting with him, and I started realizing that this was more than just a one-off investment deal. This was something that increasingly folks were looking at as a national security issue.
Unfortunately, they seem to be looking at it as a national security issue after the purchase went down, which isn't great forward thinking. Not that I'm an expert in forward thinking or strategy at a national level. Was there any burden that Chinese company had or hurdle that they had to clear, or was it literally a matter of having cash in hand and then the agricultural committee and the government started looking at it in postmortem?
Mostly post-mortem. There are, these types of large deals have to go through regulatory processes, but they don't have to go through they're not reviewed through a national security lens. That's done through CFIUS, which they're usually looking at more like technologies or military equipment or devices or technologies. And CFIUS will and does review those. But in this case, and there has been almost every year since I first did that story, after I first did that story, across the aisle, Senator Stabenow and Senator Grassley introduced legislation in the Senate that would require CFIUS to look at large agricultural purchases like this, to start including agriculture in the CFIUS process. And they still haven't changed that. So
That checks out.
yeah, right.
Man, what for the listeners and viewers, can you describe the connection between the Chinese company and the Chinese government? How closely aligned are they?
Well, they're really closely aligned. This particular company started as a state-owned enterprise and then had gone public on the Hong Kong Stock Exchange via WH Group. But even then, even if it's not a directly owned Chinese business, China just has a different model of running its government, of its economy. And that means that there's usually someone from the government, from the CCP, from the Communist Party, that'll be in a large company like this. And, we'll have direct communications with the CEO. And as somebody very high up in the company told me, the Chinese government basically sets out its 5-year plans, and then it gives the companies the freedoms to sort of achieve those goals. But you're expected to achieve those goals that are laid out by the government, even if you're a publicly traded company. And one of those 5 years goals are securing food and water resources around the world. And that's what that was one of the driving factors, if not the driving factor, for this purchase that is effectively 1 in 4 American pigs.
Which it segued nicely into The Grab as well, which is the documentary that I have referenced already one time. What got China to that point where they decided that they needed to buy or wanted to approach Smithfield?
Well, there's multiple incidents in China's history that have led to that. I mean, I think going far back along that timeline, of course, it's the Great Famine, when I think the sort of mainstream estimates are 37 million people died in China, um, in 59 to 61, if I'm remembering the dates off the top of my head. Um, Basically, inside China, they'll call it the years of natural disaster, but it was government policy that pushed forward an agenda that didn't work and screwed up their agricultural system and left them lacking adequate food supplies. And so the current leadership of China, like Xi Jinping and others, remember a time of deep, dark deprivation where there wasn't enough food and people, and you have to think that if 37 million people actually um, succumbed to death as a result of malnourishment, that meant there were 100 million plus people that were along that same path. So it would have been a really horrible time. And they remember that. And then they begin to look around and they see that there is growing prosperity in their country. I mean, China's economic rise has been amazing. And I think one of the important things here is also that one of the greatest achievements of the 20th century was that in a couple decades, China pulled 400 million people out of extreme poverty. 400 million people, I mean, talk about results.
Yeah.
Um, but one of the issues that then comes up is if you have more middle class, and I think China now has the world's largest middle class, you have more people that can afford to eat what food economists will say up the food chain, but really they just mean meat. So you now have more people that can afford to eat meat. And meat requires a lot of grain, a lot of livestock feed, soy, corn, that requires a lot of land, that requires a lot of water. And China doesn't have enough water to grow enough food to meet that rising demand. And there have just been increasing indications in the global marketplace that the world is teetering on not actually being able to meet that demand for countries. And there was a guy, Lester Brown, who in the late 90s wrote a book called Who Will Feed China? And Lester worked within the US government, and then went on to an academic career, and is just a widely celebrated agroeconomist. And when that book came out, that rattled the Chinese government enough to actually officially release a statement denouncing his book. And as he tells it, to send hecklers, as he was touring around universities talking about it. They would plant hecklers in the audience. And truth be told, and now I've talked to people who Chinese folks that have looked into it and researched this. It was that book that really woke up the Chinese government, and they began, as the Chinese government can do, taking really rapid action to solve this. And that meant directly buying and controlling food and water resources around the world. And I think now most other nations, especially wealthy nations, have woken up to this reality. Our government, the ODNI, the Office of the Director of National Intelligence, did an intelligence community assessment in 2012 on water. And that's like the highest intelligence product our government does, where they pull in the CIA and the DIA and the various intelligence communities to do this very thorough intelligence assessment on water. And the whole backstory on how it was that they ended up doing that report is pretty astounding, because they were initially resistive to it. And by the time they were finished with it, as Major General Richard Engel said, mea culpa, this is a top line national security issue. And so I think other governments have really, and then the Arab Spring, I'm kind of jumping around now.
Yeah. Well, they're
But I
all
think the Arab
intertied.
Spring, exactly. And I think the Arab Spring really proved the Chinese decision correctly, and started pushing other countries to catch up as when these droughts and grain shortages around the world in kind of 2009 to 2012 time period, where food prices really spiked. You saw a bunch of Middle Eastern and North African countries that couldn't afford to continue to subsidize grain imports at the levels they had, which meant that they then had to begin raising prices on on food items, basic food items like bread, and populations that were already upset with their governments over mismanagement and probably perceptions of corruption and other issues. I think we all get it's just humans. It's just like a basic level. If you can't feed your kids or you can't feed yourself, but probably especially if you can't feed your kids, you get to a point of just being like, well, all right, let's go. It's go time.
It's the famous quote, "The nine meals from anarchy."
That's right. And you saw a lot of governments topple throughout the Middle East and in North Africa. Um, and after that moment, I think that was really the moment where countries went from being like, yeah, theoretically that seems smart, you should be buying up food and water resources around the world, to being like, we are going to spend huge amounts of money to begin to buy up food and water resources around the world.
The Smithfield purchase by China. When did you realize that you were going to follow that thread and build something into what became the Grab? Because they are connected, but I'm assuming, like you said, you found the Smithfield or somebody presented to it first. The Grab is, I'll let you describe it, but if you could explain to me how it kind of grew and then what it became and what it is.
Yeah, The Grab is a feature-length documentary directed by Gabriela Cowperthwaite, who did Blackfish about SeaWorld about a decade ago, and then went on to do scripted movies in Hollywood with Casey Affleck and Jason Segel and Dakota Fanning Johnson. Shit, sorry. I don't know Hollywood very well, so I'm not going
Nor
to
do
rattle
I.
off actors' names. Yeah. So, but an incredible director. And she and I, so it's a feature length documentary directed by Gabriella, and it premiered last year at the Toronto International Film Festival. And we're really hoping that it's going to be in theaters and available widely beginning next year. It takes a look at the national security and global security implications, really through a lens of the Defense Department and intelligence communities and Wall Street, of what exactly is beginning to happen with the world's food and water supply. And because there's really no substitute for us as a species if we don't have food and water, like
Yeah.
there is if we don't have oil, or if we don't have the minerals necessary for for battery capacity. It gets really scary really fast.